Marisha here. Today I'm going to share why I ended up in the UK instead of just staying in the States or going to some other European country. Now, the seeds for how I ended up in the UK got planted before I even decided to leave the teaching profession. And it really was sort of a series of events that had kind of like a domino effect that led to me being here. It was shortly before the pandemic, and I started watching clips of QI on YouTube. For my American audience who aren't familiar with QI, it's a British TV show. QI stands for quite interesting, and I won't get into all of the explanation about it. You can just go try to find some clips on YouTube. But essentially, it's a show where you learn a lot of really interesting random facts. So it's right up my alley as someone who was, for example, the captain of her Quiz Bowl team. And I really just started liking this show, and the way that it's set up is that there are guests each show. So you have different sort of comedians that come on each week. And there's one permanent panelist named Alan Davis who I sort of fell in love with over time and really looked up kind of the things that he had been in and started watching shows that he had been in. And then another comedian that I discovered from this show who I really liked is David Mitchell. And I did the same thing with him. I looked up what shows he had been in, started watching all of them, and it really was sort of serendipitous that this happened shortly before and then into the pandemic, because now I'm in this situation where I need a lot of ideas of shows to binge because I'm stuck at home during the pandemic. But with David Mitchell, I discovered that he had also written a series of articles for The Guardian, and some of them had been compiled into books. And I ordered he has two books that are sort of compilations of his articles. One is called Thinking About It Only Makes It Worse, and the other is Dishonesty is the Second Best Policy. I also ended up ordering his memoir, not because I thought his life would be particularly interesting, but because I ended up liking his writing style so much that I thought it would probably be um, an entertaining read simply because of the way that he writes. Anyway, I'm reading his articles and I sort of am thinking to myself, you know what? I bet my students would like to read some of this. Like, it's funny. I wonder if I could sneak one of his articles into my lessons. Well, sort of serendipitously, that summer, the summer of 2020, IB, which stands for International Baccalaureate, and for my American audience, is an alternative to advanced placement. So most Americans are familiar with advanced placement, but there are schools in America that instead of advanced placement use what's called International Baccalaureate curriculum. And it's their version of kind of the advanced classes. So for my advanced seniors IB class, IB changed the curriculum that summer of how we were supposed to teach the nonfiction portion of the course. And now we had to have two bodies of work, and each body of work had to be five or more pieces of nonfiction by the same writer. And because we were entering the school year in the pandemic, 100% virtual, with the possibility of the entire school year being virtual, I felt really bad for my seniors. I thought, there's a chance that these kids are not going to get a prom, a senior all night party. They're not going to get to graduate in person. I just thought it's going to be so awful for them this senior year. Like, how can I throw them a bone? And that was happening at the same time as this curriculum change, and at the same time that I'm reading these David Mitchell articles, and I realize I'm going to make David Mitchell one of my bodies of work so that they can have some levity in their lives, right? So that not everything that we read in this class is like deathly serious, because man, these kids have had enough just being, in the pandemic, and some of them have already lost grandparents to COVID, and everybody's, already just burnt out on doing school virtually. And now we're looking at the possibility of an entire school year doing it virtually. So I'm going to do David Mitchell for one of my bodies of work. that means that I get on the Guardian website and start, searching it for articles that I think would be the best ones to use with my students, right? These are things that are going to particularly resonate with them or be particularly kind of amusing to them, but are still about a topic that lends itself to a good class discussion as well as, discussions about the writing itself. Over the process of several months, when I'm, kind of going there and scrolling through the website, eventually this little thing pops up saying, "You've visited our website like 99 times. Why don't you send us some money?" And I thought, yeah, I probably should give them some money. So I did, and I get put on their mailing list. And, maybe a month or so after that, one of the emails that I get from The Guardian is advertising an informational Zoom session on a creative writing study abroad program at a university in the UK. And since it's the pandemic, of course it's online, so I'm able to attend this thing and it's not going to cost me any money, just an hour of my time. So I think, you know what? Sure, let's just see what this is all about. It's a creative writing and publishing master's program at the University of Lincoln, and it includes an internship with The Guardian. And so I'm attending the session and they're talking about it. And the more they're talking about it, the more excited I'm getting. And I'm thinking, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. Because I had made the decision by then to quit teaching, but I had given myself an extra school year to work so that I had that time to sort of figure out my next steps. And I'm excited, I'm excited. And then I find out this program is not open to international students. But what I did learn in that session is that master's programs in the UK, by and large, are only 1 year. So I'm not missing out by not, well, I'm a little bit missing out by not being eligible for this program, but I can look for other creative writing programs in the UK that will only be a year long. And suddenly, this idea is very doable. So I started researching and I honestly just started Googling, like, what are the best rated creative writing programs in the UK? And there are different websites or different organizations that put out their own like lists and opinions on these things. So I look at several of them and eventually compile a list of maybe 15 universities. And I make a big chart that I put up on my wall. And I list the university and I list how much tuition is for an international student and I list everything that I can find about the housing situation, like how much it costs. Are there discounts for international students? Because some universities have that. Are there guarantees as an international student that you'll get a slot? Because university housing, you have to apply, and sometimes more people apply than they have like room for. Um, how far away is this university from an airport? Because I knew that high up on my list of priorities was the ability to do additional international travel while I was abroad. Are there famous alumni from the school? Is there anything else in particular that makes this university stand out? Basically, all of the things that I could think of that I would want to like take into consideration when making my choice, and I plotted it all out in this chart, and eventually whittled it down to about five that I applied to. Wait until I start to hear back. First university that got back to me rejected me. And it was catastrophic. I cried because I thought, oh no, what if they all reject me? And then, then I have to figure out plan B. And oh, it was awful. And I kid you not, like 2 hours later, I got an email from another university asking to set up um, an interview. So that was a real roller coaster of emotions that day. Ultimately, I got accepted into three of the universities that I applied to. The fourth one, like I said, rejected me. The fifth one, I didn't hear from them for a really long time. And I was sort of getting to the point where I had to make a decision. Like I had to let this university that I had pretty much already decided was the one I was going to go to anyway, but I had to let them know. And even though, given what I knew about the universities that I had applied to, I was sure that this is the one that I wanted to go to. The way that my brain functions, I needed the closure of, hearing from this last university. So I contacted them, and like the next day they got back to me and said like, "Oh yeah, sorry, you don't have a spot." And I was really upset because I just thought that was a really quick response. So obviously you knew that. Why were you sitting on this information? Like, why didn't you tell me sooner? And I'm venting this to some people that I knew, and they said probably you were on an unofficial wait list, right? Like some universities don't have an official wait list where they notify you you're on a wait list. They just sort of like don't get back to you right away. And they said this is probably what they were doing. And maybe if you had not contacted them and had waited, if someone had not like taken their slot, then you might have been accepted. Ultimately, it didn't matter because like I knew that I was going to choose this other university, but again, just because of the way that my brain functions, I like to have like all of the information possible. So the university that I went with was Birkbeck, and it is one of the many schools under the University of London umbrella. And I chose it for several reasons. One is the program itself looked the most appealing to me because they offered a genre module. Um, and my experience with writing courses, because my undergrad was in English with a creative writing emphasis, had been that they sort of sucked the joy out of writing for me because they were taught sort of with this expectation that you were trying to write the great American novel. And that's not why most people go into writing. And so the idea of going to a place that like acknowledged that some people want to write genre fiction, some people want to write just fun stuff that's entertaining. That's their number one goal, is to entertain people. It's not to win the Booker Prize or to like change lives with their writing. Um, I just felt like that seems like a good fit for me. The second reason is that it's in London, and London is obviously a great transportation hub. It's a lot easier to find trains to any number of places in the UK and to find flights to any number of places throughout Europe and, the Middle East and things like that. If I had gone to one of the other schools that I had been accepted to, I wouldn't have been in a city that had an airport. It would have made trips abroad that much more like complicated and time consuming. And honestly, my number one priority in doing all of this was not actually to get my master's, it was to have a mental health sabbatical. Master's was a secondary goal. Master's was, you know what? I can't just take a year off and not do anything because that looks really bad to employers. But if you take a year off and you're devoting that time to your studies to getting your degree, that is something that, looks good to employers. And also, it was something that I had been wanting to do for a long time anyway. It's not like the master's was an afterthought. It was something that I had been thinking about doing for, a couple of decades, probably, at least one decade, I think. But again, I will say that even though I was looking up what are the best creative writing programs, getting the very best education possible was not my top priority. Ultimately, it was, is this a good enough education program, right? Because top priority, mental health. And part of that was, I know within that year, I want to be traveling, and because travel is like good for my soul. So London was another reason. And on top of that, on top of it being a hub to travel to other places, London itself was a great place to be able to explore. And that was kind of the third reason why I chose Birkbeck, because it's evening classes, which left me the day to explore London, and explore it I did. And I might do another video about that because I packed my year with things, and I did and saw things that even native Londoners weren't aware of. So, like, have you been to the funeral museum? Because I have, right? Like, I mean, it was obviously the big stuff, but a bunch of little stuff too. And that's kind of why I chose Birkbeck. And I wouldn't have been here if it hadn't been for QI, right? Because I wouldn't have known that UK master's programs were only a year. If I hadn't gone to that informational session, I wouldn't have known about the informational session if I hadn't been bullied into giving the Guardians some money and getting on their mailing list. And I wouldn't have been doing that if I hadn't been like looking for the David Mitchell articles. And I wouldn't have been looking for David Mitchell articles if I hadn't discovered him on QI. So that's sort of how, Alan Davis is the reason that I ended up here. But in addition to that, I was already sort of primed, predisposed toward coming to the UK because I've been an Anglophile since I was a little kid. I mean, since I was like 6 years old, watching reruns of the Monkees on Nickelodeon, had a crush on Davy Jones, and completely oblivious to the fact that like he was no longer that he was older than what he was in the show because it was a rerun. Like it didn't register that the clothes and hairstyles were out of date. And of course, as a 6 year old, completely oblivious to like that there's no way that you would have any chance with this guy because he's like in his 20s and you're six. It was just, but he's cute and he talks neat. And then after that, it was, just loving the Beatles in middle school and then sort of graduating to Led Zeppelin in high school and, getting into Monty Python because my brothers introduced me to it and seeing other, British shows on TV that made it here, made it to the US, and just really liking that and really liking James Bond. I love James Bond. It was such a big part of my formative years. I might even do a whole separate video about it. Um, and I had been, dreaming of living in the UK since I was a little kid. And I had been trying to actively make it happen through study abroad since my undergrad. As an undergrad, I had tried to come to the UK and it didn't work out because my university didn't have a program that went to the UK. And they suggested that I try to go through some other university to do it, like another American university. And it was some university out in California, and I'm in Michigan. I'm trying to make phone calls with them with the time difference and get information via phone on this stuff because while the internet existed, it did not exist to the extent that it does now, where it would have been easy to do things via internet. And just logistically, it didn't work out. And then when I went back to school to get my teaching certification, I was trying to get to the UK to do my student teaching. Um, but that was only offered in the fall semester, and my student teaching fell in the spring semester. So I had to go to Australia instead. And I don't want to make it sound like, well, I had to go to Australia because obviously I didn't have to go anywhere. Most people didn't do study abroad for their student teaching. And obviously, Australia was great. I loved it and I'm blessed. But what I'm saying is that twice before I had tried to make study in the UK happen and it hadn't. And so it was like, 2 decades later when I'm finally making it happen. And I think what I would maybe want to end on here is that idea that just because something isn't working out right now doesn't mean that it never will. It took me decades to get to this point, and when I finally announced it on social media that I was going to be studying abroad in England, um it you know I couldn't believe it. It was just like finally this dream realized. And there's a part of me that still, even though I've been living here now for like 20 months or something, and I've got my degree, and now I'm on a different visa and trying to find work and hopefully stay here indefinitely, it still kind of doesn't feel real because it's been such a dream for such a long time that had been deferred. It was a dream deferred for a really long time. So, I don't want to, I really hate to say, like, don't give up on your dreams, because it sounds like such a cliche, sort of trite thing to say. But the reality is, just because something isn't working out right now doesn't mean it won't or can't in the future. And there is absolutely something to be said for perseverance and for continuing to hope. So that's kind of how I ended up in the UK and why I'm here, why I chose it. And I'll try to do a video in the future where I kind of talk about like James Bond or maybe some other things like that. But like and subscribe, tell your friends how gnarly this channel is, and I'll see you next time.